He refers to above as the super-apostles are Hebrews whose authority he does not question, but he tries to match their qualifications with his own. Since many boast according to human standards, I will also boast. 2 Corinthians 11:18. Brandon argues that Paul's super-apostles are indeed the original apostles of Jesus. Ibid. pp. 152–153. Paul, curiously, despite his exceeding agitation over their activity, never names them. Whoever they were obviously Christians of great authority or representative of leaders of great 72. Development of the Christian doctrine authority. For they were able to go among Paul's own converts and successfully present a rival interpretation of the faith. Moreover, although he is so profoundly disturbed by their action, Paul never questions their authority as they did his. These facts, taken together with Paul's very evident embarrassment about his relations with the leading apostles at Jerusalem, point irresistibly to one conclusion only, that the other gospel, which opposes Paul's own, was the interpretation of the nature and mission of Jesus propounded by the Jerusalem church, which comprised the original apostles of Jesus and eyewitnesses of his life. Not all biblical scholars agree that the super-apostles were the original apostles, and that the different gospel was that of the Jerusalem church, but for some there is a very good case for their being so. In fact, the very name super-apostles seems to be evidence. Who else would fit such a name? The passage we quoted earlier from Acts 21:20–26 demonstrates that the original apostles had differing views from Paul, and they had the authority to enforce those views, at least by writing to the Gentile converts to abstain from what has been sacrificed to idols and from blood and from what is strangled and from fornication. This is important because, as stated before, Paul never met Jesus. He had no first-hand knowledge of Christ's teachings. Yet most of what we know about the very early years of Christianity comes from Paul's letters. And the gospel of Christ that has survived has come through the Pauline tradition. All this means that we do not know for certain what the original followers of Jesus taught. And more importantly, we do not know how much of Jesus' own teaching has reached us unflavored by Paul's understanding and that of his tradition. One thing we do know is that the differences among the early members of the church were deep and divisive. Paul's letter to the Galatians makes that clear. Scathingly, Paul exhorts his readers to stick to the gospel he had delivered to them. Where did the concept come from? 73 I am amazed that you are so quickly forsaking the one who called you by the grace of Christ for a different gospel. But even if we or an angel from heaven should preach to you a gospel other than the one that we preached to you, let that one be accursed. Galatians 1:6–8. New American Bible. Whoever Paul's opponents were, they had authority that Paul felt he needed to counteract. This is shown by the fact that he goes on by defending his own authority, and then attacking those who apparently were preaching a return to Mosaic law. For all who depend on works of the law are under a curse, for it is written, "Cursed be everyone who does not persevere in doing all the things written in the book of the law." And that no one is justified before God by the law is clear, for the one who is righteous by faith will live. Galatians 3:10–11. New American Bible. In fact, the above verse shows that Paul actively fought against those who observed Mosaic law. This is reinforced by the following verses. Once again I testify to every man who lets himself be circumcised that he is obliged to obey the entire law. You who want to be justified by the law have cut yourselves off from Christ, you have fallen away from grace. Galatians 5:3–4. New Revised Standard Version. One of the strongest pieces of evidence that Paul's opponents were the original apostles comes in Galatians 2:6–14, and from those who were supposed to be acknowledged leaders. 74. Development of the Christian doctrine. What they actually were makes no difference to me. God shows no partiality. Those leaders contributed nothing to me. On the contrary, when they saw that I had been entrusted with the gospel for the uncircumcised, and when James and Cephas and John, who were acknowledged pillars, recognized the grace that had been given to me, they gave to Barnabas and me the right hand of fellowship, agreeing that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. But when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face, because he stood self-condemned, for until certain people came from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles. But after they came, he drew back and kept himself separate for fear of the circumcision faction. And the other Jews joined him in this hypocrisy, so that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. But when I saw that they were not acting consistently with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas before them all, "If you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you compel the Gentiles to live like Jews?" Galatians 2:6-14. New Revised Standard Version. We see here that initially it was James, Cephas and John who recognized Paul's authority. What about the other Jerusalem apostles? Were they the important and prominent ones who wanted Paul to add to his teachings? If not, why were they not mentioned? And what was he supposed to add? It seems logical that these opponents were original apostles, and that they wanted him to preach the following of Mosaic law. The above quote shows that later, in Antioch, even Cephas had a run-in with Paul over the practice of Mosaic law. Paul, where did the concept come from? 75 accuses him and the other Jews of dissembling, and not being straightforward about the truth of the gospel and of wanting to force the Gentiles to accept Mosaic law. If Paul attacked even his own supporters among the Jerusalem apostles, it seems inevitable that he was at odds with them as a group. Given the extremely strong prohibition of idol worship in any form, which is at the core of Mosaic law, it is almost certain that any tendency to deify Jesus would have been strongly resisted by the Jerusalem apostles. This could well have been the basic cause of the rift between Paul and the original apostles. Brandon argues Ibid, p. 154. According to Paul's own testimony, his gospel was repudiated and his authority as apostle was rejected by his opponents. This the leaders of the Jerusalem church could effectively do, because Paul had never been an original disciple of Jesus, nor had he learned the faith from them. However, the irony of the situation, from our point of view, is that it is Paul's gospel that has survived and is known to us from his own writings, whereas the gospel of the Jerusalem Christians can only be reconstructed from what may be inferred from Paul's references to it and what may be culled, also by inference from the Gospels and Acts. This apparent triumph of Paul's version of the faith is surely to be traced to the Jewish overthrow in AD 70. That final sentence is important. Brandon draws a parallel between the esoteric Jewish community at Qumran whose books were hidden before the community was destroyed by the Romans in AD 68. Those documents are now known as the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the community that authored them is known almost solely through them. Fairly recently those very scrolls have been made available to scholars at large, stirring great hopes for a breakthrough in our understanding of Judaism at the time of Christ and thus, early Christian development. Brandon proposes that the Romans also wiped out the Christian community in Jerusalem, which strongly maintained its ties to Judaism, in AD 70. Thus its documents were lost as a consequence of the Jewish uprising there. 76. Development of the Christian doctrine. The annihilation of the Mother Church of Jerusalem meant that the original leaders of Jewish Christianity were killed or dispersed. Also, there must have been a strong political force encouraging the moving away from Judaism and any traditions that identified a community as being tied to Judaism. These factors would have greatly aided in the strengthening and spread of non-Jewish concepts among early Christians. They would have almost certainly helped the spread of the concept of Jesus's deification, especially given the Roman custom of deifying their own leaders. Possible affect of Paul's background. We can only surmise how much of an effect Paul's background had on the development of the Christian doctrine of Jesus as God incarnate. A. N. Wilson, in his book Paul, Mind of the Apostle W. W. Norton, 1998, page 26, offers some interesting thoughts on the matter. Paul was born in Tarsus and is often referred to as Paul of Tarsus. Every year Heracles, a Greek divine hero, was honored in Tarsus by great religious ceremonies. Every autumn in Tarsus the boy Paul would have seen the great funeral pyre at which the god was ritually burnt. The central mystery of the ritual was that the withering that of the summer sun had brought the god to his death, but that he would rise to life again in the spring, at about the time when the Jews were celebrating the Passover. From inscriptions in Tarsus we know that Heracles, in his dying and descent into Hades, was regarded as a divine savior. Thus, Heracles, who had one divine parent and one human one, might possibly have served as a model for Paul in his interpretation of Jesus and his life and death. If this was the case, Paul may not even have been conscious of it. It is also possible that Wilson puts too much stress on Paul's birthplace, as in Acts 22. 3 Paul indicates that he was brought up in Jerusalem. Where did the concept come from? 77. I am a Jew, born in Tarsus in Cilicia, but brought up in this city at the feet of Gamaliel, educated strictly according to our ancestral law, being zealous for God, just as all of you are today. Acts 22. 3 New Revised Standard Version. However, the parallels between the Pauline image of Jesus as a divine Son of God, who was Savior to mankind, and her equals may be worth noting. Wilson also mentions that Tarsus was a center of Mithraic worship where initiates drank the blood of a sacrificial bull or a chalice of wine symbolizing it. Ibid. p. 25. This seems reminiscent of the wine of the Eucharist. Prior to the Nicene Councils, for over the first 300 years after the crucifixion, the nature of Jesus and his relationship to God the Father was understood in a variety of manners by different segments of the early church. There were those who believed that Jesus was just a mortal man who had a very special relationship with God. Then there were those who agreed with Theodotus of Byzantium that Jesus was born a mere man and attained the ability to work miracles at the time of his baptism. Some of Theodotus's students later believed that Jesus became God after his resurrection. And then there were those known as monarchians who believed that God and Jesus were one and the same from the beginning of time. Some believed that Jesus was created, and some of those believed that he was fully human but shared his body with the Son of God. Others who believed Jesus to be human believed he was adopted by God. Those whose understanding eventually won out believed that Jesus was fully human and fully God at the same time, as 78. Development of the Christian doctrine exemplified by the traditional doctrine of the Incarnation, as briefly discussed next. Doctrine of Incarnation. The doctrine that was codified and eventually accepted in 325 by the First Council of Nicaea is basically that Jesus Christ was the incarnation of the second person of the Trinity, and was truly God and truly a man at the same time. All other understandings were decreed to be heretical by the conference. We will examine the doctrine of the Trinity